Hey, welcome. My name is Bill Butler. I'm the president of the Black Rock Historical Society. I welcome you to our 2020 speaker series. Black Rock Historical Society is chartered by the Regents of the University of the State of New York as an educational organization where we celebrate and preserve the story of historic Black Rock and the continuing history of our Northwest Buffalo communities. I wish to thank our speaker series program manager, Janine Barron, for organizing this year's agenda of interesting and thought-provoking speakers. Thank you for joining us, and I encourage you to check our website and our YouTube channel for a complete list of speakers. We are sorry you cannot be here with us, but please feel free to email your questions and comments to us. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's presentation and a good friend of the Black Rock Historical Society, Angela Keppel. Angela is an urban planner and history enthusiast. A lifelong Buffalonian, Angela lives in juxtaposition between where we have been and where we are going as a city. Angela runs Discovering Buffalo, one street at a time, where she blogs about Buffalo streets and how they got their names. She works as a project manager with Buffalo Place, the downtown Buffalo business district. Welcome, Angela Keppel.
Thanks, Bill. So as Bill said, I am Angela Keppel. Born and raised here in Buffalo, grew up spending a lot of time going to places like the History Museum, Fort Niagara, really learning about the region's history has always really interested me. And then about 10 years ago, I wanted to know how Keppel Street got its name. It's my last name. It's a small street in South Buffalo that is off of Elk Street, if you're interested in where it is. So I started doing research about Keppel Street. And now we're at almost 10 years later. I still don't know how Keppel Street got its name, but I've learned the story of all kinds of other streets, and so I started writing this blog, Discovering Buffalo One Street at a Time, which you can find at buffalostreets.com. And I've written about more than 175 different street names across the city. And so today we're going to focus on some of the streets here in the Black Rock area. The first street I'm going to talk about is Parish Street. This is a short 2-block long street that's located off of Niagara Street near the International Railroad Bridge. The signs today say Parish, P-A-R-I-S-H, but it was spelled historically P-A-R-R-I-S-H with the 2 R's. Interestingly, when I was going to take the screenshot of Google to show the street on this map here on the slide, Google Earth has it with the 2 R's, but Google Maps, which you'd think is the same data set because it's the same company, they had it spelled with 1 R, Parish. Either way, the street is named after Jasper Parrish, who most historical records I've seen have spelled his name with the 2 R's. Jasper was born in March of 1767. When he was 11, he and his father were kidnapped by the Munsee tribe of the Lenape Native Americans. Those Native Americans were those who lived along the Delaware River in what we would consider the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Jasper's father was returned to the family in a prisoner of war exchange. Jasper remained with the Native Americans for more than 7 years. In 1780, he was sold to a Mohawk chief and was adopted into their family, which was the Hill family. In 1784, at the end of the Revolutionary War, Jasper was given the choice to stay with the Hill family, his Mohawk family, or to return to his own family. He decided to return to the Parish family. At the time, he was fluent in the Delaware and Mohawk languages and had actually lost most of his understanding of English because he had been living with the Native Americans. When he returned to his family, he went back to school for about a year. He studied a great deal trying to catch up. Because of his language skills, in 1790, he was asked to serve as an interpreter for the newly formed U.S. government. In 1792, he worked in Canandaigua, working with the 6 tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy. He worked for the government for almost 30 years, helping to negotiate treaties and secure wampum for the Iroquois, which I think is one of the other topics that you can learn about in the Black Rock speaker series. So be sure to check that out as well. So the parish tract was a tract of land along the Niagara River. This land was in the 1 mile strip, which was land that was set aside for the state of New York. Everything outside of the 1 mile strip along the Niagara River was owned by the Holland Land Company. Everything in the strip was owned by the state, and the state began to sell it off. Jasper Parish, along with Horatio Jones, who you can also learn about during the Black Rock speaker series. We're all tied together here in Black Rock. They both received land grants of 640 acres, which is a square mile. You can see on this map, the stuff shaded in red, that is the parish tract. And then above it, north of it, was the Jones tract. The parish tract was laid out in 1803. It was located along the north side of Scajaquada Creek. In 1824, Mr. Parrish sold off 172 acres of the northern section of his tract to William Byrd, which became known as the Byrd Farm. Byrd Avenue and the Byrd Island Pier are both named after William Byrd. Colonel Byrd was one of the builders of the Black Rock Harbor and was also a nephew of Peter Porter, who was one of the original founders of Black Rock. So before 1830, the area in lower Black Rock around the Black Rock Market Square was often referred to as the Parish Square Mile. Before the 1830s, there was not much development here, very sparsely populated. And around 1830, the area began to be laid out. This map might be a little hard to see. If you look closely, you can see that some of the street names changed names. So Parish Street was originally Erie Street. Main Street on this map is now Niagara Street. What was Niagara Street became Dearborn Street. Locke Street became Hamilton Street. Batavia Street became Austin Street. Division Street became Byrd Street, which then became Hurdle. So as you can see, there's a lot of name changes. One thing that I think is interesting is, you can see here's East Street, which is still East Street today. And so this was kind of this little village area. Everything over here was farmland. And so it really was the eastern kind of boundary of this little neighborhood in 1830. So it kind of, that's why it's East Street. And then there was North Street, which became Farmer. And then down here, south of Parish Street was South Street. So that there was, south, east, north, and then I guess the canal would have been the West Street. But a lot of these street names were changed in 1854 when Black Rock was annexed by the city of Buffalo. So a lot of times they changed the names. Often it was to remove duplicates. So they already had a North Street down in Buffalo in Allentown, so they had to change North Street became Farmer Street. And so because a lot of those name changes happened all at once in large groupings, it's often hard to research. As I was saying before, my research started trying to find Keppel Street. Keppel Street was one of the ones that was changed in a large group. And actually on the day that Keppel Street was named, there was 150 other streets that were changed by council just on that one day. So if you can imagine, that's a lot of street name changes. So the reporting on it was a little bit more vague. And so it makes it a little harder to research some of the streets in this area. So while, I kind of think that Hamilton Street might have been named after Alexander Hamilton, and then Dearborn Street after Henry Dearborn, who was also involved in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, I've not been able to find evidence that specifically, supports those claims. So maybe some people who are involved with the Black Rock Historical Society may have additional sources. If so, please reach out. There's also a second Jasper Parish Street, Jasper Parish Drive. This is the short little street that goes through the Jasper Parish apartments near the corner of Military and Hurdle. The apartments were built by the Buffalo Municipal Housing Authority in the 1950s, and they named the complex and the street after Jasper Parish. It's actually built on land that was a part of the original parish tract. The site before those apartments were there was actually a cemetery that operated from 1870 till 1921. It was the German Methodist Episcopal Cemetery. The Housing Authority purchased the land in 1851. They moved all of those remains to Elm Lawn Cemetery up in Tonawanda. The cemetery was used by the Ripley Memorial Church, which is the church in this picture here, still standing at 221 East Street. And they have, sometimes when they're doing sewer work, found other additional human remains on the property there, and then they've also exterred those and moved them to Elm Lawn as well. But that's the second Jasper Parish street. Next, we're going to talk about Austin Street. Austin is a street that runs between the Niagara River and Military Road. The street is 1 mile long because it runs through the 1 mile strip that I had mentioned earlier that was set aside by New York State. So it was 1 mile long out to Military Road. And when the village of Black Rock was incorporated in 1813, Austin Street was actually where the northern boundary of the village was, although it was not yet named Austin Street. The street is named after Stephen Goodwin Austin. Mr. Austin was born in West Suffield, Connecticut, to Joseph Austin, who was a farmer, and Sarah Austin, a sea captain's daughter, in 1791. He studied at the Academy in Westfield, Massachusetts. He went to Yale, and he graduated with honors in 1815. After graduation, he began his study of law in the office of Daniel Lewis in Geneva. In 1819, he received his license to practice in the state of New York, so he left Geneva and came to Buffalo in 1819. When he came to Buffalo, the project of creating the harbor to be the port and to be the end of the Erie Canal was the big issue of the day. So he saw that there was great potential in the area, decided to settle here, made the city his home, became a lawyer. He also served as Justice of the Peace in 1821, just for 1 year. While he was Justice of the Peace, an important trial came under his jurisdiction. Tommy Jimmy, also known as Tommy Jemmy, or his Native American name of Sue-Ann Geis, was accused of murder. The woman killed, Quakata, was a Seneca woman who was accused of killing a man using witchcraft. She had fled up to Canada. Tommy Jimmy, at his chief's request, brought her back home. Once they crossed back into the Native American reservation lands, he killed her. Chief Red Jacket and other Native Americans testified that this act was in accordance with tribal law. Since the land was sovereign land, Justice Austin and the Erie County Court was unable to make a decision in the case. They held that the tribal law was able to govern their sovereign land. So the jury found that the woman was executed in accordance with tribal law. Therefore, it was not their job to make a decision. The case moved up all the way to the Supreme Court. The court also did not render a decision upholding that the Native Americans had sovereignty over their land. So this was an important law case, really setting the precedent that the sovereignty of the Native Americans on their tribal land. Mr. Austin was a very successful lawyer. As his business grew, he accumulated a large estate. He invested much of his savings in real estate from the time he first arrived in Buffalo. Buffalo grew and rewarded him. He was able to retire at age 52 with a very large fortune. So he purchased land on the southeast side of Niagara Square in 1928. He married Lavinia Hurd in October 1829. They had 4 daughters, 2, Adeline and Frances, died quite young in childhood. A third daughter, Lavinia Hurd Austin, was born in 1833 and married George Russell of Philadelphia. Lavinia Russell died in 1874. The final daughter, Mrs. Truman Avery, also known as Delia, was born in 1842. The family lived at 11 Niagara Square, which is where the Buffalo Athletic Club is now. Right now it's also called the Athletic Club Building. They have a new owner, so they've changed the name. But the house was located right here. So this picture is taken as if you were standing at City Hall. So just kitty corner from City Hall was their house. on the square. The house was built by Benjamin Rathbun. Mr. Rathbun was one of the early builders of Buffalo and was especially prominent during the 1830s. In 1835 alone, he built 99 buildings, just him. So the Austin House was completed in 1836. The house was a site of lots of entertainment. At the time, Niagara Square was home to many prominent Buffalonians, the Wilkisons, who was a mayor of Buffalo. The square itself was the most fashionable part of town. This picture here would have been from a little bit later, about 1914, which you can tell because over here behind Erie County Hall, that's the telephone building, now the Verizon building. And that was built in 1914, so this view is from around then. But newspapers reported that Mrs. Austin and her daughters were the most accomplished hostesses, and they presided with grace, dignity, and charm over all the events at the Austin family home. After the family left the house in the 1890s, the house was converted for business purposes. The house was demolished in 1922 to become the new clubhouse for the Ellicott Club. The Ellicott Club was a social club that had outgrown their space in the Ellicott Square building. When they moved to Niagara Square, they became the Buffalo Athletic Club. The premium level of membership at the downtown BAC, even up until the early 2000s, was still called the Ellicott Club membership. And so they kind of retained that title but became the Buffalo Athletic Club. The family were also members of First Presbyterian Church, which at the time was located on Main Street at the corner of Main and Church Street, where the Main Place Mall is now. The Austin family gave to many organizations. Their donations were often under the radar because it was reported after Mr. Austin's death. Little is known of his gifts because of his conviction that charity should not be seen or talked about. Mr. Austin's wife, Lavinia Austin, was also involved in a lot of those charitable efforts. She was a founder of the Buffalo Orphan Asylum. The organizational meetings to develop the asylum were held at the Austin family house. She also donated $10,000 to the organization, which allowed for the infant ward addition to be built in 1877. She also left $9,000 to the Ingleside home, which was a home for unwed mothers and wayward girls, and $5,000 to the YMCA after she died in 1884. Mr. Austin died in 1872. He is buried in the Austin family plot in Forest Lawn Cemetery. At the time of his death, his estate was estimated at $2 million, which would be about $42 million today. After he died, the family still remained at the Niagara Square house, along with Delia's husband, Truman G. Avery. So Mrs. Austin had purchased in 1880, several years after her husband's death, this building here, which is at 110 Franklin Street. Like their home on Niagara Square, the church had been built by Benjamin Rathbun. It had been built for the Unitarian Church. So originally this was the Unitarian Church of Buffalo. Millard Fillmore worshiped here when he was in Buffalo. And then after Mrs. Austin purchased the building, the former church was expanded to become 3 floors. So when it was the church, it was only 2 floors. They expanded it up and added a 3rd floor. The remodeled building was referred to as the Austin Building or the Austin Block. Over the years, the remodel, unfortunately, is often credited to Stephen Austin, even though it occurred years after he had died. But I was able to find sources of that time, the 1880s, that actually said Mrs. Stephen G. Austin. So at some point they must have dropped the Mrs. accidentally and they credited the building to him. But after the building was converted to offices, it was said to be one of the finest in the city. They were elegant and well decorated. They were occupied by the offices of F.W. Calkins, who was an architect. He actually designed the remodel of this building. The Buffalo Cement Company, Lee and Zink was in here, which was a real estate firm. Green and Wicks, another prominent architectural firm, and other companies over the years. The upper floor consisted of a grand hall, which was occupied by the Academy of Fine Arts, which is now the Albright Knox Art Museum. The Academy, as it was known in those days, occupied the entire third floor, a room on the second floor, and a room in the basement. The hall on the third floor was lit by skylights from the ceiling to allow as much light as possible. This was before modern electricity. They were located here for 5 years. After that, they moved into the Buffalo Public Library, which was building their new building on Lafayette Square, which we'd call the old public library now. This building here on Franklin Street is currently owned by Erie County, and right now it's actually, they're doing some exterior renovations. I believe that this is the oldest building in Buffalo that's still on its original spot. So it's good to see that Erie County is taking care of it and keeping it in good shape so it lasts until the future. Mr. Austin had also owned 204 and 206 Main Street, and then Delia, his daughter, took over management of his buildings after her father's death. The building on Main Street was taken down in 1905 to become the Merchants Exchange, the Chamber of Commerce building. Some of you may remember when that building was still on Main Street. Mr. Austin also owned the building at 302 to 304 Main Street. That building was managed by his daughter as well after his death. Delia also obtained several properties in her own name. She built a building in 1891 at 77 Pearl Street. This up here is a picture of that building. This building right here is the 302 to 304 Main Street. It's also called 300 Main Street sometimes. Which is still standing. The one on Pearl Street, unfortunately, is no longer standing. So Delia then, she married Truman Gardner Avery in 1868. Truman Avery was a lawyer who came to Buffalo from eastern New York State. When he came to Buffalo, he gave up law to become a grain merchant. The Austin family owned much of the land where Symphony Circle is today. In 1887, Delia Avery donated a parcel of land at the Circle to become First Presbyterian Church. She donated the land in honor of her parents, so the church was then able to sell their downtown property on Church Street to Erie County Savings Bank, who built their headquarters there. They used those proceeds to be able to build their current building at the Circle that we all know today as First Presbyterian Church. And then just across the Circle, the Averys built their own mansion here. So the mansion was constructed in 1892. Delia was also involved in a lot of organizations like her parents. She was on the board of the Ladies Hospital Association at Buffalo General, the 20th Century Club, and the Home for the Friendless. She was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution as well. She died in 1922 and is buried in the family plot. After her death, it was said, no worthy cause ever appealed to her in vain. So she gave her money to a lot of endeavors over the years. So her daughter, named Lavinia Austin Avery, was born in 1876 when the family still lived on Niagara Square. Lavinia attended Buffalo Female Academy, which became Buffalo Seminary, and the University of Buffalo's Teachers College. She married James McCormick Mitchell in 1907. James Mitchell was the son of the Reverend at First Presbyterian Church. So after her parents died, Lavinia no longer wanted the Avery Mansion on the Circle, so she offered those 4 acres of land to the committee that was working to build a new music hall. Money had been left in the wills of Mr. and Mrs. Edward Kleinhans to create a foundation to build the new music hall. Several locations were looked at for the hall, including at Humboldt Park near the Science Museum and at Delaware Park near the Rose Garden. At the time, residents were opposing that. They didn't want parklands given over to another building. They wanted the parklands to be open to be used by all. And so the Buffalo Foundation upheld that and decided they didn't want to build in a specific park. So the land on Symphony Circle was kind of the perfect area, although at the time it was not yet called Symphony Circle, it was called just the Circle. And so Lavinia offered the land, and it offered the best of both worlds. It was on this tree-lined parkway with easy access to the parks. It looked, very like a park because it was open land. They had a lot of space to build. There was trees. And so we were able to get Kleinhand's Music Hall. The property was officially sold in July of 1938. So the mansion was demolished and Kleinhand's was built. And then they renamed the circle, became Symphony Circle. Lavinia had been president of the Garrett Club. She was on the board of directors of the 20th Century Club. She and her family lived at this house here on Oakland Street, or Oakland Place. This house is often referred to as the Pomeroy House. She died in 1968, and she is also buried in Forest Lawn in the family plot. Next, I'm going to talk about Chandler Street. Chandler Street runs between Military Road and what used to be the New York Central Railroad tracks. Historically, this area was home to factories and industrial buildings. The access to the railroad made it a prime place for these businesses. The buildings along the street were home to Jewett Refrigerator, the Double Truss Cornice Brake Company, Acme Steel, Barcelo Manufacturing, Buffalo Weaving, Lindy, Loblaw Groceria, and others. In the last few years, Chandler Street's kind of become a hip new place. Rocco Termini and Signature Development has redeveloped several of the buildings. Some call the area Chandlerville, the way that the Larkin District has become Larkinville. Buildings have new businesses, Barrel and Brine, Blackbird Cider, Thin Man Brewery, Tapo Pizza. It seems like every couple months something new opens over there. The street is named after Henry Chandler. Henry Chandler was born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1830. He was a descendant of William Chandler, one of the earliest settlers in Andover, Massachusetts. Arrived in America in 1637. As a boy, Henry moved to Seneca County, New York with his family. At age 15, he got a job teaching at the village school. He was always said to be very artistic from a very young age. So while he was teaching, he supplemented his income by painting signs and decorating wagons and sleighs for people. In 1850, he came to Buffalo and he got a job as a typesetter at the Commercial Advertiser. While he was working there, he figured out a process for engraving that made it available to the general public. He used a wax process that allowed reproductions to be done at a much quicker, more easy process. Prior to this, if you wanted a new map, it had to be redrawn. And so this is an example of one of the maps that was done using Henry Chandler's process. So the first job they used the process was in 1853, which was the cover of a book that was published by Finney and Company, who owned a bookshop on Main Street near Seneca. The second job was a set of calendar frames. He was having such great success, Henry invited his brother to form a business venture in 1856. In 1859, Elam Jewett, who owned the Commercial Advertiser, used Henry's process to win the bid for engraving from the U.S. Patent Office. So every patent that was done by the U.S. Patent Office was reproduced and printed using this printing process that was developed by Henry Chandler. Henry and his brother joined the company. It became Jewett and Chandler. They established an engraving house on Washington Street. In 1874, Matthews and Northrop joined the business. They were known by several names throughout the years, including J.N. Matthews, Matthews Northrop Works. For many years, all the illustrations of the U.S. Patent Office used his process. It was also used for map engraving. The company was world renowned. Often when you see old maps, you'll see the Matthews Northrop name on it, and those were all done here in Buffalo using this process. One of the interesting maps that used this process was General Pershing's maps to guide the troops into Mexico, and by President Wilson during his talks in Versailles. So these were, internationally known maps that were created right here in Buffalo. Henry married Frances Long. They had two sons, Henry Long and Frank Darwin, and a daughter who died as an infant. The third son, Albert Hotchkiss Chandler, survived to adulthood. Mr. Chandler owned property throughout the city, including the land where Chandler Street was built. He also owned their home, also on Niagara Street, much like the Austins. Right here, this is the property next to City Hall, right across the street from the Statler Hotel. And this was the house right here. The house was at 89 Niagara Street, was built around 1852 by Philo Belcom. Mr. Belcom was a trustee at the Baptist church that was located right next door to this house. And he also owned a brick business, so this was one of the buildings that he built using his bricks. It's a 2.5-story brick Italianate house with a 4-story tower built in the Second Empire style. Henry Chandler's nieces were interviewed after he had died, and one of the things that they said about their uncle's house was that it was the fancy house because they had a first-floor bathroom, which in the 1870s was very unusual, and so it was really exciting that the girls remembered that, oh, we could use the bathroom there. So when City Hall was built, and the U.S. Courthouse on Court Street, the State Office Building, the Buffalo Athletic Club, the Statler Hotel, Niagara Square had moved away from being a residential neighborhood and had become more of a civic center, kind of the center of government. So the house became a restaurant, had many different names over the years. It was Valentine's, Grill 92, Carlos O'Ryan's. The house was sold in 2000 to the federal government for $50,000. At the time, they were looking to build a new courthouse on the site. So this house, the last remaining house on Niagara Square, was demolished in 2007 to build the new courthouse. Mr. Chandler had owned horses, which he was known for riding along Delaware Avenue. He also donated to many causes, including to First Baptist Church, the Buffalo Historical Society, the Young Men's Association, which became the Buffalo Public Library. He was a member of the Science Museum, Beaver Island Club, and the Buffalo Field Club. He was also an accomplished poet, and his poetry was published in several magazines. He died in December 21st of 1896, and he is buried in Forest Lawn. His son Albert worked as an electrician in the U.S. Navy during the Spanish-American War. At age 26, he decided to enroll at Cornell to study civil engineering. He became city engineer of the city of New York. In that role, he worked on the first city-owned sections of the modern subway system. So he built the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and M lines. And the N, Q, and R trains still run on the tracks from the original lines that Albert Chandler put down back then. He was also responsible for many of the city of New York's grade crossing improvements, and he drew preliminary plans for many of the bridge and tunnel approaches to Manhattan at that time. And then Henry's grandson, Harry, enlisted in the Air Force right after Pearl Harbor. On March 15th, 1945, Harry was flying a mission just north of Berlin. After completing the mission, the plane was hit by a shell, taking out the controls. His co-pilot was non-responsive, so Harry was ejected from the plane as it spiraled. He landed in a field, was captured by the German police, and spent 2 months as a prisoner of war. It was only later that Harry learned that his mission had been very important. He had destroyed the factory that the Germans were using to develop an atomic bomb. So a connection to Buffalo that helped prevent the Nazis from having an atomic bomb. And we thank you, Harry. The next street is Argus Street. Argus runs in Riverside for a few blocks between Vulcan Street and Esser Avenue. The street is named after Francis Argus, one of the original owners of the land that's now Riverside Park. George Argus, Frank's father, came to Black Rock from Bavaria. The older Argus worked as a teacher in the parochial school system. Then he went into the grocery business. Frank was born in Black Rock in 1854. Mr. Argus married Mary Himes. They had 2 sons and 2 daughters, Francis, Clarence, Maud, and Olive. They lived at 1916 Niagara Street, which is near the corner of Hamilton. This is a picture of the building. It's still standing. For 40 years, Mr. Argus operated a hardware store in this same building where they lived. The store sold hardware, cutlery, and stoves. Building's still standing. It looks like the store front is now also apartments, but this building would have had the Erie Canal flowing through its backyard when the Argus family lived here. Now it abuts the 190. The children really oriented towards medicine. The son, Frank, became a nose and throat specialist. Clarence Argus became a dentist, and the daughters both married doctors as well. The daughters went to Holy Angels Academy and became accomplished pianists and organists. They were known around town for giving recitals. Dr. Francis Argus was a major in the Army during World War I, and he served at the Army Hospital in Petersburg, VA, and the Tuberculosis Hospital in Denver. Frank Argus was a commissioner of the old Jubilee Reservoir at the corner of Delaware Avenue and Auburn, which is what supplied Black Rock with water at the time. After the reservoir was abandoned, the site was purchased by Albert Laub. Mr. Argus insisted that the property not be sold unless it was agreed that the funds from the sale were used to build a library. So the Waterworks property was sold in 1899, but it took years before the proceeds were released and a new location for a library was selected. So the Jubilee Branch Library opened on December 20th, 1915 at 1930 Niagara Street. The Jubilee Library was the first non-rented library space in Buffalo. It was designed to have a children's side, an adult side, and an auditorium in the basement. The site was also constructed next door to a city-owned community center that had a gym, helping to create a very community-oriented space at that corner. The site was selected by the city, and at the time there was some concerns about the safety of children crossing the railroad tracks, as well as the waterfront location. And so people were a little concerned when the library was built, but it ended up being very successful, and the continued development of Black Rock really helped the library be successful. It was particularly well used by many of the industrial businesses in the area. They had a pretty large industrial research collection at the Jubilee Library. And so this success of the library really helped to encourage the Buffalo Public Library to pursue creating additional branches. And so by 1930, Buffalo had 14 branch libraries throughout the city. When Mr. Argus, Mr. Esser, and Mr. Hurdle sold the Riverside Park property to the city, Mr. Argus also insisted that the rights along the river were relinquished to the city so that the public would have access to the water through there. He was very, that was a cause that he was very important to, that it didn't become a private dock. He was a boater and a charter member of the Buffalo Launch Club. He was also a member of the Knights of Columbus. After retirement, he traveled throughout the United States. He spent his winters typically in Florida, California, or Cuba. He enjoyed to return every summer to Buffalo, where he lived at a house with his son at 237 Lafayette. And I guess the house was very well known for Frank's beautiful gardens, which his son Clarence continued after his father's death. Mr. Argus died in 1940 at the age of 85, and he is buried at the United French and German Cemetery in Cheektowaga. So I don't know if you guys have questions. If you're watching this and have questions, you can email me at buffalostreets@gmail.com. You can visit my blog at buffalostreets.com. You can also find me on Facebook and on Instagram. Thank you.